The Checkpoints is presented by pharmaceutical company GM Pharma.
Lilia, thank you for your time and thank you for taking our questions. Lilia, ADB has raised 2024 growth forecast for Georgia. What is the logic behind this decision?
Thank you very much for the invitation. So as you mentioned, last week we released our flagship report, Asian Development Outlook, and we revised up 2024 growth forecast for Georgia. So now we expect growth to reach 7.0% instead of 5.5% that we were expecting earlier this year. So the main reason behind this is that economic activity has been quite strong in the first half of the year, exceeding expectations, not only for ADB, but also other partners were not expecting this strong growth for Georgia. So we saw GDP growth reaching 9.0% in the first half of 2024 compared to 8.2% last year during the same period. So these are quite good signals of strong economic growth for this year, although we expect that in the second half of the year, so the growth will slightly moderate, so will be lower compared to the first half of the year, but overall annual growth will remain quite robust. And this robust, strong economic growth was mainly driven, as you know, by domestic demand, consumption, mostly in a low inflationary environment, increased bank lending, but also raising wages. So purchasing power of the population increased. So consumption has been driving growth in the first half of the year. And that is also reflected what we see in the services growth. It reached 11.3% growth in the first half of the year. So yeah, the main logic behind is very strong domestic demand that we observed in the first half of the year, and that was the main reason we revised up our forecast for this year.
Lilia, what do you see? What trend do you see in remittances to Georgia? What weight does it have in economic growth of Georgia? You mainly mentioned the domestic demand, but what about the remittances?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because as you know, in the past few years, especially last year, economic growth was fueled, especially private consumption was fueled by strong money transfers from foreign countries, mostly from bringing for migrant inflows and migrant transfers. So the difficult part is that the definition, we call it remittances. So it's not really remittances. So it's a broad concept of money transfer, which means migrant inflows coming to Georgia, they bring money with them. So it fuels private consumption, it fuels domestic demand. So that was one of the main drivers in the past year. What we see now is these huge inflows of money transfers is normalizing. So this was an exceptional spike. We correlated with the high inflow of migrants into Georgia, but then we see this normalization. But we also see, and that's based on the central bank data, that the source of money transfers is diversifying. So we see more and more money transfer from other countries than Russia. So it's a kind of interesting development, because the landscape of money transfers is changing, and also some migrants who migrated to Russia, they are now changing their status, so becoming residents. So it's difficult to call it remittances when the person is residing in the country. So all these changes is making quite difficult to monitor the situation, but what we are expecting and what's happening is normalization of these high inflows.
In general, how sustainable is Georgia's economic growth? Because you remember how after COVID, and also when the war started, these projections were quite hard to make, right? Almost all the development partners of Georgia were projecting that this war would have a almost a devastating impact on Georgia's economy, while everything turned like upside down, right? It was vice versa. These effects from migration effects or whatever effects working as a booster for Georgia's economic growth, they were also projected that they would fade away quite sooner, right? But you also mentioned that this impact is still there, and Georgia has high economic growth. So how sustainable is that growth? What is ADB's finding in that direction?
You're right. In the last 3 years, if we look at the average growth of the last 3 years in Georgia, that was it reached 9.7%. This is one of the highest rates in the Caucasus Central Asia region. And we, again, as I mentioned, we expect that growth will remain robust this year as well. So, and again, it's difficult for forecasters to understand how long these high growth rates will remain. So how sustainable are drivers of economic growth, as you mentioned. And but at the same time, as you see in our forecast for the next year, we are expecting a slight slowing down, moderation of growth, reaching close to 5.5%. So what we think is that downside risks are quite high to the outlook. It includes both domestic but also external geopolitical risks that can at any moment exacerbate exchange rate pressures. It can hit supply chains. Transportation costs can go high. And at the end of the day, it can create high inflationary pressures for Georgia's economy. And it will make the task of the central bank quite difficult to ease monetary policy further. So this is why these downside risks are quite important and sizable, although the growth rate is quite high, but at any moment this risk can materialize and impact growth prospects for Georgia. So this is why, and you see in the central bank's communication as well, the central bank is quite cautious because this downside risk may create inflationary pressures and make it difficult to ease monetary policy further. So yes, it is difficult to right now say that these growth drivers of the past few years are sustainable because they were due to quite exceptional factors. But the good news is that there are some structural changes are happening. So right now the potential growth of Georgia is estimated to be close to 5%. So if these structural reforms bear their fruits and become effective, we will see this potential growth to become higher, so sustainable and more sustainable.
Thank you so much, Lilia, for that clear answer. Does ADB see like Georgia's economy is more dependence on Russian economy? And my question stems from the geopolitical risks that you also mentioned, and also the sanctions list. Probably you have also watched Sky News several reports when they are talking about the possible sanctions evasions because of this automobile industry and the doubts that have been there forever, right? But do you see these trends of Georgia getting more dependent at some point on Russia's economy? And do you weigh this in as one risk that Georgia might have at this point?
Actually, not only for Georgia, for the whole Caucasus Central Asia region, we are clearly mentioning that this is part of the downside risk. That's what is called this geo-economic fragmentation risk, where trade flows are changing, and countries are trying to adapt to new trade routes, etc. So this is creating this geo-economic fragmentation, and of course it brings some risk itself, because businesses it will be difficult for businesses to adapt. It will take time, and also it can push transportation costs high. Again, that creates inflationary pressure. Uncertainty in commodity markets can be an issue for the economy because, again, it translates very quickly to domestic inflation when commodity markets, including oil prices, go up, not only due to due to geopolitical challenges in the region, including what we are seeing now in the Middle East. So that can really bring these external shocks to domestic economies of Georgia. And this is part of the downside risk we are considering, not only for Georgia, but for all countries of the Caucasus and Central Asia.
When you mention this domestic policy uncertainty, that's part of this bigger picture, as you say. And what do you mean more specifically under this domestic policy uncertainty?
First of all, that's, we think that, as I mentioned in the beginning, there were quite important external inflows into the country, and including migrant, FX, tourism, and any reversal of that can impact domestic policy. So this is a source of uncertainty for the Georgian economy. But also, as you know, in the experience of other countries also show that when there are electoral cycles, it creates kind of loss of reform momentum. So that also could create kind of domestic uncertainty in the country and impact investment, business decision, etc. So this is the two sources of domestic policy uncertainty that we consider for the outlook.
Would you say that this IMF standby program, if active, could have mitigated a little bit of those risks that you are looking at as ADB?
Yeah, I think we can say that because, as you see, all risks, most of the risk for the Georgian economy comes from external shocks. So, which means to make Georgia's economy resilient and sustainable, the country should strengthen its resilience to mostly these external shocks. So it means creating implementing prudent macroeconomic policies, but also macroeconomic stability, replenished fiscal and reserves of FX reserves buffers can also mitigate those external shocks. But that's really in the short term, medium term. In the long term, of course, to become more resilient, the country needs long-standing structural reforms, but also capitalize on new economic opportunities, including the accession to the European Union. It also means diversifying the economy. For example, you mentioned this trade diversification, regional connectivities is a big opportunity to create this resilience to external shocks that are the main threats, I would say, to the economic growth.
Thank you so much for mentioning structural reforms. I would like to ask you a little bit more in detail towards the end, so that we will show what kind of perspective Georgia might have with these structural reforms to build up this resilience that you rightfully mentioned. You also and ADB also considers elections as a factor for almost like many countries in the region, including U.S., Pakistan. What are some of the findings there for Georgia? Because Georgia is also in less than a month is facing quite big and important elections.
Yeah, that's Georgia is definitely, as all developing countries, also emerging economies, they are all exposed to this normalization of the U.S. monetary policy, because that means a higher risk of capital outflows from developing countries, including Georgia. And it means leading, again, increased inflationary pressures through exchange rate, but also through expectations channels. So it is a risk for all Asia Pacific. Our Asian Development Outlook report has a dedicated chapter analysis on how this US monetary policy normalization can spill over to the domestic economies in the region. And yeah, that's one of the global shocks that we should monitor in the coming years. Maybe, yeah, starting 2025. And this is also one of the reasons we are quite cautious about our forecast for the next year, because these high global risks from external side are quite significant for Georgia. Yeah, any change in external demand will reflect in exports. Any change in capital outflows will be reflected in Georgian economy. So this is something to monitor for the next few months and to see if we need to adjust our growth forecast for the next year.
What about the domestic business and investment environment? Because these elections might have some spillover effects on that, and it already has that spillover effects on that. Do you evaluate it, how sound this business and investment climate in Georgia might be during and after elections, and is it something, a factor that is considered, especially when driving FDI and these inflows that might not have only this spillover effects from the war, but also like the sustainable inflows of FDI into the country?
Yeah, as in any country, election cycle really means uncertainty, and that's we observe in all countries. So as I said, this is part of this domestic policy uncertainty risk that we consider for our outlook and for the forecast. And that creates uncertainty for businesses, investment, households as well, to understand how the reform progress will continue before and after the elections. And that's part of the uncertainty. It has impact on it may have impact if this risk materialize. They may have impact on growth prospects. But at this stage, as I mentioned, the 2024 growth prospects are quite high. So we don't see any risks regarding policy uncertainty to materialize, because bank lending is still strong. It boosts also domestic investment. We don't see any major impact so far in data that is available.
Also, probably, I would argue that you had much more factors to consider while measuring the outlook, Georgia's economic growth outlook, especially for 2025 and onwards. Have you considered this possible, the possibility of sanctioning Georgia's high officials, or something like these threats that are coming from Georgia's tensions between among its strategic partners? Is it a factor in any way that is also weighing in as a risk in this outlook?
As I mentioned, we consider the broader context of geopolitical risks. So this is, it includes any changes in geopolitical landscape that can impact trade flows, financial flows, migrant flows, tourist flows. Any change that's happening regionally and globally can be reflected in Georgia's economy, because as I mentioned, this is the economy is quite exposed to this risk. And what we consider is that we take it into account as downside risk that at any moment can materialize. But of course, we are monitoring. So far, we don't see those risks to materialize. But this is part of the cautious approach in our forecast, that although growth is quite strong, downside risk remains sizable. This is why we remain quite cautious about our forecast.
Okay, and also about the structural reforms, and I know you don't have much time, so structural reforms, what do you see as like the priorities in those structural reforms, and do you see those 9 preconditions that the EU had for Georgia on its way to the EU membership as some kind of a roadmap that Georgia could stick to in order to build up this resilience and sustainability that we have been considering here during our interview?
Yeah, well, in this ADO report, we are mostly focusing on short-term impacts, but structural reforms are mostly for the long-term horizons and perspectives. We do mention that, yeah, the structural reform momentum is there, and it is needed for stronger and more inclusive, job-rich economy. It includes many aspects that's also included in ADB Georgia country partnership strategy. We see all these infrastructure bottlenecks, transport, energy sectors, low sectoral productivity growth in agriculture. That is a very important area to invest and to implement reforms. Aging population, outward migration, but also, yeah, that could be financial sector, access to finance. So these are really long-term reforms to implement, but these are also important to take advantage of economic opportunities that emerge for now for Georgian economy, including the prospects for joining the European Union.
What about the middle corridor, Lilia? Is it a real, tangible tool for developing further at this point, looking not only to Georgia but looking to the region as well more broadly?
So ADB has very extensive work on this. As you know, our Central Asia Regional Economic Cooperation Program, CAREC program, is focusing on this middle corridor development. We have several knowledge products, technical assistances in this, including Georgia. So we do see opportunities for, as you mentioned, these tangible opportunities for Georgia, but mostly, of course, medium long term, because this requests investments in infrastructure, in services development. But the opportunities and the potential is there. This increased connectivity that can help unlock potential and new trade routes. We have one upcoming study that will be published soon, and basically it will look at trade flows and transport route opportunities for this middle corridor. Well, without going into details, the main conclusion of that study is that it is a viable option for CAREC countries, including Georgia, to achieve this strategically important goal, which is diversifying from traditional transport routes and also diversifying external and trade partners. So this is what this study will conclude, and also it is based on already existing studies by other development partners. You know, EBRD, OECD, World Bank, they all released studies mentioning this important and tangible opportunity for many countries in this region, including Georgia.
Oh, thank you so much. Looking forward to that study. And my last question: what does ADB at this point see as like like a bankable infrastructure projects that Georgia might be looking at in this light that we have discussed to make this middle corridor opportunity a more tangible one, not only for Georgia but for the region as well?
Well, the country partnership strategy that we released earlier this year in March is, I would say, increasingly focused on that issue, how ADB can help the Georgian government to make it as a regional champion to increase connectivity, leverage the geographical advantage of Georgia, and make it as a regional gateway connecting the Caucasus and Central Asia to Europe and the rest of the world. This is really the essence of the country partnership strategy of ADB with the Georgian government in the next few years. and it includes many different areas for investment, mostly complex infrastructure, transformative policy reforms. It includes a lot on how the private sector development role can increase, and how to help Georgia to build this multimodal transport network. But it also includes, of course, issues on climate change, disaster resilience. So yeah, this I would say the next few years up to 2028, our country partnership strategy is quite clear that this connectivity and higher infrastructure development is the core of ADB Georgian government partnership.
Thank you so much, Lilia, for this very interesting insights and very interesting interview. And I would like to conclude with the message that you have briefly mentioned during our interview, that EU membership is essential for Georgia. Why does ADB support Georgia's EU membership at this point, and how that relates to Georgia's sustainable economic prosperity, so to say, and that will be your last message from our interview to our viewers and followers.
ADB, here again, I would refer to our country partnership strategy document. It clearly mentions that ADB, the Georgia's role as a regional gateway to Europe and the rest of the world, is one of the main goals for ADB in the coming years. And that includes also all opportunities emerging, how to diversify transit, trade routes, partners, etc. So these are all bases and important opportunities to support long-term inclusive and resilient growth for Georgia.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your time, and thank you for taking our question once again.
Thank you very much for the interesting discussion.
The Checkpoints is presented by pharmaceutical company GM Pharma.